This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Susan Laurie Park's Father Comes Home from the Wars opened this month at Yale Repertory Theater in New Haven. The trilogy, described as a new American odyssey, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Drama and was awarded the 2015 Edward M. Kennedy Prize for Drama, inspired by American history, as well as the 2014 Horton Foote Prize. Coming up, we'll speak with Amy Baratko, literary manager at Yale Repertory Theater, about the play and learn how it's part of an initiative to expose young people to the arts. First, do you know Constance Baker Motley's story? The New Haven native and child of immigrants was the first black woman to become a federal judge. Before that, she was a civil rights attorney for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. She won many desegregation cases in federal court, including suits against the University of Mississippi and the University of Georgia. And she successfully argued before the U.S. Supreme Court. She was also the first black woman to be elected to the New York State Senate. Judge Motley had a distinguished career, so why isn't she a household name? Join the conversation. Email Where We Live at WNPR.org. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. My first guest has written a book about Motley. Dr. Gary Ford Jr. is an assistant professor of Africana Studies at Lehman College and author of Constance Baker Motley, One Woman's Fight for Civil Rights and Equal Justice Under Law. Gary, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Tell us, when did you first hear about Constance Baker Motley?
I first heard about Constance Baker Motley when I was a little tyke growing up in New Canaan, Connecticut. I grew up in a family of lawyers. My mother's a lawyer, my father's a lawyer, my older sister's a lawyer, my older sister's husband is a lawyer. It was kind of the thing. And growing up in New Canaan in the early 80s, there actually weren't that many black attorneys actually in all of Connecticut. So it was a small circle. Through that small circle, I met Connie Royster, who is Judge Motley's niece, and she in turn introduced me to Judge Motley.
What about Judge Motley struck you when you met her?
Just her presence, her grace. You could tell that this was a woman who was very wise and had a lot to offer, even though she was not, she was not very boisterous. She's usually pretty reserved, but if you sit there and just listen to her for a while, you can hear history.
She passed away in 2005. After you met her, and again, you knew about her story through your family connections. What made you then write a book about her later on?
Well, it's a couple reasons. First of all, when I was at Harvard, I was studying African American studies, and I was focusing on the civil rights movement because that was my interest. And I was reading about all of these cases, these desegregation cases that really were crucial for the movement. And I remember hearing her talking about these cases as a child. And I was like, well, we have James Meredith, we have Charlene Hunter Gall, we have Hamilton Holmes, but there's no mention of the woman who actually represented them and actually won those cases and gained them entry to those universities. So that struck me as a bit odd. And I began to learn that the African-American history that I was learning was incomplete. We have this traditional narrative of the civil rights movement that tends to focus mostly on black men, usually in the clergy, and it does not have enough space for other alternative leaders who did crucial things for the movement, but because they're not in that traditional leadership role, they are kind of overlooked.
Women like Constance Baker Motley who were overlooked. Again, I'm speaking with Dr. Gary Ford Jr., who's written a book about this Connecticut native. She was raised in New Haven. The book is Constance Baker Motley, One Woman's Fight for Civil Rights and Equal Justice Under Law. We're going to learn more about her contributions to the civil rights movement and how she became, later on, one of the first black women to become a federal judge. But I was curious about her upbringing. Can we start there? She was born in New Haven. Tell us about her family.
Yes, her family, I think, informed her worldview very much so. Her parents were from Nevis. They were immigrants. A typical immigrant story. You move to the United States. You try to work your way up and make a better life for your children. So her mother was a stay-at-home mom, and her father was a chef. He was a cook, which was one of the few occupations that was open to black men at that time period. And he worked at some of the prominent Yale eating clubs, including the Skull and Bone Society. If anybody's seen the movie Skulls, it's based on that. But anyway, so she grew up in a large family. She's one of 12 siblings, and her time in New Haven, she described it as fairly free of racism, except for a few incidences, which is not to say that New Haven was perfect at the time she grew up there, but it was far preferable to what was going on in the South at that time.
So in New Haven, there was a lot of West Indians that were living in the part of the city that her family also lived?
Yes.
And how did that play a role in her upbringing and where the family hung out, the church they belonged to?
Yes. Well, she went to St. Luke's Episcopal Church. She grew up around a lot of West Indians, as you said, particularly ones of who were under British rule. So a very similar shared culture. This reserved nature that's typical of people coming from, say, Barbados or Nevis or Jamaica. So that was kind of provided a buffer for her because she had this community and this support network that was beyond her family. And I think that allowed her to kind of grow up not experiencing some of the biases that other people might have been experiencing in New Haven at that time.
So she was growing up in the 20s and 30s.
Yes.
Again, New Haven was a diverse city of immigrants.
Yes.
And when was her first time where she noticed discrimination because of the color of her skin?
The first time was when she went with a group of friends. It was a diverse group of friends, and they went to go swim at the beach, and her friends were allowed in, and yet she was denied entry to that beach, a place of public accommodation, because of the color of her skin. And that really struck her as the first time when she really felt that she was being othered, and that had a profound effect on her later in life.
When did she first get a glimpse of the fact that, women could be attorneys too? Because at that time there weren't very many women, if at all, practicing law. Who were her role models?
Yes, hardly any. There were two black women in particular who she knew of in childhood that kind of gave her the courage to pursue her dreams. Usually if you see somebody who looks like you is doing something, then that makes it possible for you to do it. Those two women were Eunice Hunton Carter and Jane Bolin, who both worked in New York. I think one was appointed by Dewey, the other was appointed by LaGuardia. And so she knew of these women, and so she knew it was possible for a black woman to become a lawyer.
What about her family? Did they think it was possible for Constance to become a lawyer?
That's an interesting question. Her mother actually, when she told her mother she wanted to be a lawyer, her mother told her that you're better off becoming a hairdresser. So that's a bit of a discouragement right there. But you have to remember, at this time period, becoming a lawyer was kind of like saying, I want to become, an astronaut. It was something that was not in the realm of possibility for a black woman because there hadn't been hardly any of them. So her mother was really trying to protect her from the disappointment of not being able to fulfill her dreams, and in so doing happened to discourage her. But of course, Judge Motley being who she wasn't going to take discouragement lying down.
She wanted to go on to college, but was it difficult for her family to afford college at that time? And how did she get an in, so to speak?
Yes. So being one of 12 children and also with a single income household, it was very difficult for them to afford college. And in fact, she couldn't afford college just based on her family. We didn't have all the scholarships that are available now. And so she took jobs to Eleanor Roosevelt, her National Youth Program. Eleanor Roosevelt being another amazing woman who's one of my all-time favorite first ladies. But anyway, so she was doing that. She was refinishing furniture, and she was also becoming engaged in politics locally, civic engagement locally. And she spoke up at a meeting to this white philanthropist named Clarence Blakesley. And basically, he had built a community center for African Americans to use in New Haven and was
Dixwell
concerned.
Avenue?
Yes.
Dixwell Avenue?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And was concerned that they weren't using it. And none of the black people wanted to tell him that the reason they weren't using it was because there's no black people on the board and they didn't feel like they had any representation. So that's why it wasn't being used. Constance Baker Motley, being one who always would speak truth to power, actually stood up at this community meeting and said it over the gasps of some people in the audience because they thought that was quite rude. But he found it refreshing and found her to be very mature and very wise for her age. And so he decided that he was going to fund her education as far as she wanted to go. And that's how she got to go to college and then law school.
She made the decision to pursue a college degree down south.
Yes.
Why did she want to do it there?
I think she wanted to experience black culture and go to an all-black university. And at the time, those were in the South. And so she got down to Fisk, and when she got down there, riding on the Jim Crow car and some of the aspects of Southern life, she felt was a hard adjustment. So she didn't end up finishing at Fisk. She finished up at NYU.
This is Where We Live. Speaking with Dr. Gary Ford Jr., Assistant Professor of Africana Studies at Lehman College, also author of Constance Baker Motley, One Woman's Fight for Civil Rights and Equal Justice Under Law. As we're learning today, Constance was a New Haven native, and she is one of the unsung women of the civil rights movement. Now, you said that she transferred up to NYU and then eventually to Columbia Law School. So one of the first moments in her career where she was a first there too.
Yes. She was one of the first black women at Columbia Law School. Her firsts are many. And she basically, when she got to Columbia Law School, she started working at the LDF. She's the first woman working there. Clarence Blakesley actually
LDF, Legal Defense Fund.
Yes, Legal Defense Fund, NAACP Legal Defense Fund, sorry. Clarence Blakesley had actually hoped to set her up with a position at a Wall Street firm after she finished law school, but she informed him that she was going to go work for the LDF instead.
And she met Thurgood Marshall. Tell me about what that was like for her.
She had great admiration for Thurgood Marshall. He from a very, very early on in their relationship, he began to give her significant responsibility. Matter of fact, she drafted one of the complaints that became Brown versus Board of Education. So they, all of the members of the LDF were very open in allowing her to assume responsibility and actually go down south and be lead counsel on many of these cases that she argued.
Why were they open to her as a woman, as an attorney? Because, again, she's one of the first, and during that time, a lot of women weren't in these roles. Why were they accepting of her?
I think even though a lot of these were men of their times, they recognized her talent. While she was even still in law school before she had graduated, her work was exemplary, and I think the LDF was not so well funded as to where they could basically squander talent such as hers by having her perform secretarial duties or something else like that, which wouldn't really maximize her talents.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today we're learning about Constance Baker Motley. She was a pioneer in many ways. First, as a female civil rights attorney in the 1960s who won several defining desegregation cases. She would later become the first black woman to serve as a federal judge. My guest today is Dr. Gary Ford Jr., who's written a book about the New Haven native called Constance Baker Motley, One Woman's Fight for Civil Rights and Equal Justice Under Law. We'll talk more about her life after the break. And you can email Where We Live at WNPR.org. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today we're learning about a New Haven native and child of immigrants who was the first black woman to become a federal judge. Constance Baker Motley was a civil rights attorney for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. She argued and won several key desegregation cases in federal court and before the U.S. Supreme Court. She also represented those who were jailed for participating in sit-ins, freedom rides, and marches, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. You may not know her name because, as my guest Dr. Gary Ford Jr. writes in his book, much of the work that Motley and other black women performed in the civil rights movement was not fully documented. They did not receive proper recognition and credit from historians for their contributions to the movement's success. Dr. Ford is in the studio with me as we learn more about Motley's life. In his book, Constance Baker Motley, One Woman's Fight for Civil Rights and Equal Justice Under Law. Let's talk about, Dr. Ford, Gary, about Constance Baker Motley's contribution to that historic desegregation case, Brown versus Board. Tell us about her role in that.
Yeah, so Brown versus Board was towards the early end of her career at the LDF, but she was one of the attorneys who was working on that case and actually drafted one of the complaints that was merged into Brown versus Board of Education, because there was a few different cases that were merged into one for Brown 1 and then Brown 2.
Now, when she did that work, you mentioned earlier that Thurgood Marshall, the team, felt comfortable sending her down south to do a lot of the grassroots work and to meet and talk to the people. What was that like for her as a black woman, as an attorney, and how did the segregationists react to her?
Well, I think there's this notion that black women being down south would be in less danger than a black man, even though the history doesn't really back that up. I think Thurgood Marshall and some of the other male attorneys at the LDF had made the argument. As a matter of fact, she says this in her autobiography, that she would have a better time in these southern courts because all white men had black mammies, I think was the quote. A mammy being a slave woman who would take care of the master's family, cook, and take care of the kids, and was not seen as very threatening. In reality, regardless of gender, if you went down south, even regardless of race in many cases, if you went down south and you were agitating and disrupting the way of life, the segregationist way of life, your life was in danger. We have countless examples of black men, black women, white women being assaulted or killed down south trying to do the work of integration.
So who kept her safe?
When she was down south in Mississippi and Georgia and Alabama, working all these school desegregation cases, there were local members of the NAACP who would act as bodyguards because they couldn't count on the police to provide protection for her.
Because some of those police were members of the Klan?
Yes, some of them were moonlighting in white bed sheets. That's just fact. And the local FBI was also had some. Sometimes they had their biases as well. So it was mostly private security, the NAACP, but also sympathetic whites who were working with the NAACP and wanted to see segregation end in their communities.
Let's talk about some other significant cases, important desegregation cases that Constance Baker Motley worked on. You mentioned James Meredith versus the University of Mississippi.
Yes.
Tell us about that effort to desegregate and allow James Meredith, a black man, to go to that university.
Yes. So there's levels to discrimination. At this time, Mississippi was by and far had the strictest form of segregation and white supremacy in the South. So getting James Meredith into University of Mississippi was a monumental task. She actually described it as the last battle of the Civil War because of the troops and the violence. When she's finally able to get him admitted to University of Mississippi, there's a riot on campus. A few people were killed. So it was a sea change for that state. It was a dynamic shift, and people weren't ready, and they responded with violence.
Even though she won that case and James Meredith was able to become a student, what was the reality for him?
Well, James Meredith is an interesting person. You have to be you have to be a little fearless and maybe also a little bit, of a dreamer in order to subject yourself to the treatment that he was subjected to on campus. He was ostracized completely. No students would talk to him. His housing situation was in flux often. Matter of fact, there's only one person who talked to him while he was there, and that was a white professor on campus who actually would have lunch with him and would interact with him in that way. And that professor actually later on ended up killing himself. It's not clear how much of that had to do with harassment associated with being, an N-word lover or whatever. But I'm sure that had something to do with it.
She also worked with the community in Birmingham during the Children's Crusade. So when all of these children, these thousands of students, black students who were trained in non-violent demonstrations to desegregate the city of Birmingham, talk us through her role there and how she worked with more well-known figures in the civil rights movement, including Dr. King.
Yes. So she represented Dr. King personally a few times, got him out of jail a few times. In the Birmingham schools case, she was really critical to his ascension as a leader of the civil rights movement because in that schools case, they had planned a march on Sunday, and somebody else who actually his name escapes my mind right now had convinced Dr. King to include children in that march. And so they included the children, and then, of course, the police responded with hoses and dogs, and the children were harassed in that way, and then also arrested en masse. Thousands of kids arrested, and while they were in jail, they were also expelled from schools, and the parents weren't going to stand for that. I mean, it's one thing for them to go through the trials and tribulations of trying to integrate, but to have their children suffer in that manner and maybe not ever graduate was too much for them. So she was sent down south to get them out of jail and then also get them back in school. There's to get an injunction to prevent their expulsion, and she was able to do that. And because she was able to do that, it restored the faith of the parents in the movement, and they continued to support Dr. King, whereas otherwise they might not have.
Well, we talked about the fact that as Constance Baker Motley had to argue in a lot of hostile courts.
Yes.
What was that like for her? I'd read in your book that sometimes these judges would turn their back as she argued a case before them.
Yes. Sometimes they refer to her as the Motley woman as opposed to Attorney Motley. Sometimes they would actually turn and face the wall when she was giving arguments, just because they could not accept a black person and a black woman basically arguing a case before them. It shook their whole worldview. Many of them grew up with black people only in subservient roles. So dealing with that also outside of the courtroom, the little indignities like having to go to the other side of town to get lunch, or people harassing you on the street, sometimes people not wanting to interact with you, even local counsel. Sometimes it's hard to get a local co-counsel because they had to live in those communities and they didn't want to upset the apple cart. So all of that was rolled in there, as well as some judges who wouldn't even call her case to be argued because they knew they were going to lose, so they were just dragging their feet. So her case would be on the docket for months and in one case years before it would be called.
She went on to represent Dr. King in other struggles. How did he view her?
He was a great admirer of Constance Baker Motley. As a matter of fact, later on, when she was up for federal judgeship, Dr. King was one of the people that LBJ called to get a sense of who Constance Baker Motley was. So he felt that he owed her a debt, not only for that Birmingham schools case, but also for getting him out of jail a few times, Americus, Georgia, and a couple other places.
This is Where We Live. Dr. Gary Ford Jr. is in studio with me, Assistant Professor of Africana Studies at Lehman College, author of the book Constance Baker Motley, One Woman's Fight for Civil Rights and Equal Justice Under Law. Judge Motley, she'd become a federal judge later on in life. She was a New Haven native, a child of immigrants, and one of the unsung heroines of the civil rights movement. Her career spanned more than 20 years, helping the civil rights movement with many of these cases in court, oftentimes hostile courts. When was the breaking point for her where she moved on with her career and couldn't do this work anymore in the South?
Okay. That's a complicated issue. Basically, at the LDF, she'd been at the LDF for a while and had won all of these segregation cases. But when the time came to pick a replacement for Thurgood Marshall, who was going to the bench, they actually selected Jack Greenberg, who was a fantastic lawyer and has done a lot for civil rights. However, Judge Motley had actually been there longer than him, and her record was equally distinguished, if not more so. I can't think of somebody who had argued and won more civil rights cases, especially school segregation cases, than her. On the one hand, I think Thurgood Marshall and Bob Carter were having a bit of a feud at this time because Thurgood Marshall was focusing most of his efforts on fundraising, which is great. I mean, without money, you don't have the resources to argue these cases. But Bob Carter felt like most of the legal work was falling on his shoulders. So he wanted Thurgood Marshall to focus more on that. And so they had a rift, and Thurgood Marshall wanted to put somebody in who was more in line with his philosophy, and that was Jack Greenberg. So he moved very quickly to install Jack Greenberg as his successor, whereas Bob Carter was supporting Constance Baker Motley. And so was Medgar Evers, who was her biggest cheerleader for that position, and was very upset when she didn't get it. So there was a politics involved. I think also we have to look at these are men of their time. Even though they gave her vast amounts of responsibility and really nurtured her to be a civil rights lawyer, I think they might have also been uncomfortable at that time with having a woman in the top chair. So I think gender also played a role in her being passed over.
We should mention before she headed back north in her career as an attorney and later a judge, she successfully argued up to 10 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court.
Yes, she argued 10 cases, won 9 of them. The 10th case, which was about the right of prosecutors to exclude blacks from juries on the basis of race, because they have their challenges. They can get rid of jurors for any reason. It's called presumptive challenge. And at the time, the Supreme Court sided with the prosecutors and said that they could exclude people on the basis of race. But 20 years later, they actually changed their mind and came around to her point of view. So really, she was 10 for 10. It's just one of those victories was delayed by 2 decades.
You mentioned Medgar Evers. He was assassinated. How did that impact her, including, again, because she was working in very dangerous circumstances? There were times that in your book you write that she couldn't fall asleep because she was worried about who would come to the house to hurt her because of her work in the courts against the segregationists.
Yes. In certain places, she felt so much the fear of violence that she couldn't sleep. And Medgar Evers, of course, was one of those places in Mississippi. He got shot right in front of the house where she slept and where she actually brought her son to Mississippi, and they stayed at the Medgar Evers house together. So his assassination and also Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination really affected her personally. And I think about that time she started to reevaluate all of the trips she was taking down south. Because she was very close with both of them. Matter of fact, she was on stage when Martin Luther King Jr. gave the I Have a Dream speech.
I'm glad that you mentioned her family, Gary, because, again, she lived up north, but she traveled so often and worked in the South. Tell us about what that strain must have been like and the fact that she had a supportive husband who who he was able to take care of the son or have others take care of the son while she's doing this work?
Yeah, I mean, it was a great strain on her to be away from her family. And I'm sure her family missed her. Her son has said that he missed her when she was gone. But their family dynamic was so strong that they were able to get through it. And this is time to really talk about her husband, Joel Motley the second, who was he was also an attorney. He went to NYU Law, and he was in real estate in New York. And he was a very powerful man. However, he also really admired her and respected the work that she was doing. And so he decided to take on a lot of the traditional roles that are assigned to the woman in a relationship in order to facilitate her going down south. So a lot of the child care and stuff like that, he was the one who decided to do that. So in his own way, he was also a very radical leader. People think, when they think about a radical leader of the civil rights movement, they think about somebody in a leather jacket with a fist in the sky. There's different ways to be radical. Constance Baker Motley was radical in that she would not take no for an answer as regarded race and gender. And her husband was also radical in that he was confident enough in himself to not feel belittled by taking on what was considered quote unquote woman's work.
She would leave the Legal Defense Fund, eventually becoming the first black woman to serve in the New York State Senate. And then she got a call from the White House. What happened?
Yes. So while she's in the New York State Senate, she became aligned with Bobby Kennedy. And Bobby Kennedy was actually the one who initially put her name in for a judgeship. However, they had a falling out when she supported a candidate which he did not support. And I guess he felt that she was going to basically rubber stamp whatever he wanted because he was a Kennedy. But we know from a very early age that Motley is going to speak her truth no matter what. So after that, it seemed as if Kennedy was sitting on her nomination. And that's when LBJ heard about her. And at this time, LBJ and Bobby Kennedy were frenemies. There was a rivalry there. So LBJ took it upon himself to nominate her to the federal bench. And then after he did so, he called Bobby Kennedy and asked if he wanted to be the first one to congratulate her.
At the time, there were some who opposed her nomination because of sexism?
Yes. So early on in her career, I think race was much more of a factor when she was going down south. I mean, gender was still an issue. But later on in New York, when she was being appointed to the bench, it became more about her gender. So originally, LBJ wanted to nominate her to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. They're the ones who hear all the big Wall Street cases. It's a very prestigious appointment. And the white men who were there did not want a woman on that court. So they were against that, and they had to compromise by nominating her to the Southern District Court in New York. However, there's also was some issues that she had to face there with regard to sexism.
She also, in her career, would later write her own autobiography.
Yes.
It was interesting. I think it was either in your book or that you wrote that when she died in 2005, the obituary had listed all of her contributions in her long career. But before that, there wasn't much written about her other than autobiography.
Yes. There's her autobiography. There's my book, and that's pretty much it. As I said before, my goal is to try to rewrite some of these non-traditional leaders into the historical narrative of the civil rights movement, so our children can have a more complete view of Black history, and also this is American history. So people like a Constance Baker Motley or somebody like a Joanne Robinson, who actually is the one who actually led the Montgomery bus boycott. Everybody associates that with Martin Luther King Jr., where she's the one who actually started it, distributed the leaflets, and arranged carpools for months before Dr. King got there.
She was someone who accomplished many firsts, but during that time, she never considered herself a feminist. Why?
I think it's an interesting question. I ask myself this question sometimes. I think it might have to do with the fact that first wave feminism which was what was going on at the time, wasn't really that concerned with race. And so maybe she felt that that didn't really speak for her, and that's why she didn't consider herself a feminist. I mean, when you look at her career and you look at just the way she lived her life, I think it's quite clear that she was a feminist. You know, a feminist is basically somebody who just thinks that men and women should be treated equally in society. So if you look at that definition, she definitely was a feminist, but she did not consider herself to be a feminist.
We got a message from a woman by the name of Constance Royster, who you know, a niece and namesake of Constance Baker Motley. She writes, "The family's delighted that your book and your presentations, especially to young people, are giving light to the work and life of her aunt and her place in history." As you go around to schools and you mention this monumental woman to young people, what is the reaction to her story?
The reaction is usually surprise, both from students but also from educators who are unfamiliar with her work. It depends on where I go. A few weeks ago, I was actually in New Haven schools at Hill House, at actually the school she graduated from in New Haven, and there a larger percentage of the students knew who she was. But again, at her school where she went to school, there's no real monument to her or anything. I think there's a picture of her in the library, but we have to do more to kind of get her name out there and get her the recognition she deserves. All the people she represented have the Congressional Gold Medal pretty much, and yet she does not. And actually, I've been working with Senator Richard Blumenthal to try to get her that recognition.
We've been learning about why Constance Baker Motley is not a household name, despite all of her contributions. Again, I'm speaking with Dr. Gary Ford Jr., who's written a book about this New Haven native. Because you've done so much research and you understand a lot about her life and what drove her to do the things that she did, when we look at America today, what do you think would be Judge Motley's opinion of some of the movements happening today, whether it's Black Lives Matter or what's going on in politics today?
Well, I think she probably would be disappointed with the tribalism going on in politics right now, the divisiveness. I think she was a great believer in people seeing the things we have in common as opposed to our differences. In the age now where we're having to deal with people who love to be in echo chambers and love to focus on what other people have and taking that away because they think they'll benefit more from that, I think she would be disappointed in that. She would, however, I think, be very encouraged by some of these movements that are going on. You have Black Lives Matter movement, which is a civil rights organization that's actually created and run by mostly women. I think she would find that to be very compelling. You also have the Never Again movement going on nationwide now. It started in Florida. That is also has, I'm not going to say women, but girls actually up front and leading and speaking their truth. So I think she would be very encouraged about that. And I think she would also be encouraged with what seems like a wave of new politicians who are coming to challenge the politics as usual going on right now. And I think she would be hopeful about 2018 with regard to that.
I want to thank Dr. Gary Ford Jr., Assistant Professor of Africana Studies at Lehman College, author of the book Constance Baker Motley, One Woman's Fight for Civil Rights and Equal Justice Under Law. Again, she was a New Haven native, a daughter of immigrants, accomplished so much, became a first in many facets. I should mention that she also was the first woman to serve as the Chief Justice of the District Court for the Southern District of New York, and she assumed that senior status until her death in 2005. Thank you, Gary, so much for coming in and telling us about Constance Baker Motley.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Coming up, Susan Laurie Parks' Father Comes Home from the Wars, Parts 1, 2, and 3, opened at Yale Repertory Theater earlier this month. We'll talk about the award-winning play and how Yale Repertory Theater is reaching out to young people through an initiative called Willpower. You can join the conversation. Email Where We Live at WNPR.org. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Susan Laurie Parks' Father Comes Home from the Wars opened earlier this month at Yale Repertory Theater in New Haven. The trilogy, described as a new American odyssey, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Drama and was awarded the 2015 Edward M. Kennedy Prize for Drama, inspired by local history, and the 2014 Horton Foote Prize. To learn more about the production, joining us by phone now is Amy Baratko, literary manager at Yale Repertory Theater. Amy, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Now, we just have a few minutes, but let's talk about this amazing play from acclaimed playwright Susan Laurie Parks. Why the decision to bring Father Comes Home from the Wars here to Connecticut?
Susan Laurie Parks has had a long history with our theater. So in the 90s, some of her earliest works, such as the America play, were directed here with her collaborator, Liz Diamond, who is our resident director, and she's the chair of the directing program at the Yale School of Drama. So we've had a long history with Susan Laurie Parks and launching her works, and it's been on our radar since she premiered this play at the public in 2014 to see if we can continue the life of the play and pair her work again with Liz Diamond and give it a new production here for our New Haven audiences, some of whom might remember seeing those early works of Susan Laurie Parks. And she's undeniably one of the most important voices in the American theater and will long go down in the canon. So it's also a great opportunity to give our audiences and the students that we'll talk about a chance to see what will become an American classic.
We mentioned that this was a finalist for the 2015 Pulitzer Prize for Drama. Walk us through the production of Father Comes Home from the Wars. I understand it takes place during the Civil War.
Yes, so it opens in 1862 in far west Texas, or as Susan Laurie Parks described, nowhere, and it takes place, so that's really a liminal space in the middle of the American Civil War, a place being in Texas that is still in the middle of being torn between being its own country, being a part of Mexico, and being a part of the United States, and remote from where much of the action of the Civil War that we normally associate is going on. And the play opens in this place upon a man named Hero. And Hero is a slave who has been offered the promise of his freedom if he goes to fight for the Confederacy with his master. And so he must grapple with that decision about whether to go or stay, what it means for his partner Penny, and what the odyssey he will go on, both going to war and coming back.
And this play is a loose interpretation of Homer's The Odyssey.
Yes, so that's Homer's Odyssey is one of the many ingredients that Susan Laurie Parks weaves through and glances and alludes to in her work. And there's characters like the Odyssey dog and Penny, who references Penelope, and this story of a hero who has gone to war and come back. So she's really drawing on these fundamental hero's journeys tales that we find in all of Western literature, and she goes back to the heart of it. But she also, you find Homer, Euripides, Shakespeare, Beckett, allusions to Rodgers and Hammerstein. So she's really weaving so many both inherent but like glancing blows at the classical history, theatrical and literary, that we're all familiar with.
What about this play will appeal to the traditional theater goer?
I think the traditional theater goer will really latch on to the story of Hero, who I think that we will see whether or not he's a hero or he's really an anti-hero. So he's a slave that must really reckon with what is the price of freedom and what does it mean to be free and how does one achieve it, and is that even possible in America, both during the Civil War for a slave, for somebody who is African American, and is that even possible now, a full sense of freedom and participation in society, and what legacies do we have now? So I think that there's this epic story that anybody is going to be pulled into. Susan Laurie Parks has such a keen sense of dialogue and character building while twisting our expectations. So there's going to be the surprises that you love to see when you go on a theatrical journey, and just great storytelling with a sense of humor, with a sense of compassion, and also with important questions. And the people who like classics, there's enough of the inspiration of Homer and the greats and these benchmarks of Western literature, that anybody who wants to see that or is used to seeing Shakespeare in this particular slot of our Yale Rep season, I think that they're going to be satisfied on the level that you're satisfied with a large-scale Shakespeare production.
Amy Boratko is literary manager at Yale Repertory Theater. We're talking about the production of Father Comes Home from the Wars, parts 1, 2, and 3, and why it is going to be staged at Yale Repertory Theater. Again, you mentioned the connection with Susan Laurie Parks to Yale, and how are you using this production to engage young people in the New Haven area?
Well, we have a program. It's now in its 15th year called Willpower. And when the program was started under the leadership of our artistic director, James Bundy, as the name connotes, it was to bring students in New Haven and Connecticut to see productions of Shakespeare plays. But since then, and since we don't always produce a Shakespeare play every year, we've become more expansive of finding the plays in our season that will speak to what's being taught in our local school communities and that will speak to a young person seeing theater. So over the past 15 years, 24,000 students have come through our doors to see early morning matinees. And we have decided this season and last season to do more than one production that has this offering. So earlier this season, several hundred students, I think close to 1,000, saw 2 morning matinees of our production of Native Son, which was an adaptation by Nambi E. Kelly. And now over 1,000 local high school students will come and see Susan Laurie Parks. So we think that because this play grapples with American history, because it grapples with the hero's journey that so many of these 9th and 10th graders study in their curriculum, that there's an expansive view for them to get to experience theater, but there's so many connections to what they're learning and getting to see the theater on stage. And the Willpower program is really a comprehensive program that includes study guides. It includes free workshops for the educators so that they understand our production and the theater-going experience here so they can help enrich the experience for their students. And it also includes things like this year and last year we've been doing a technical theater tour for a select group of high schoolers. And it started out last year with students that were already interested in technical theater. And this year we've incorporated students from technical schools. So there were students from K-Nor Technical School who came and they saw the production of Native Son, and then they went through and saw our shops, and they saw how their skills in technical fields could be applied to the arts. And that's something that we're continuing here and we'll do for Father Comes Home from the Wars for a select group of students. And so it's really a chance for these students to really see not only art, but how the skills they're learning in their classroom can be applied to an artistic career.
Susan Laurie Parks' Father Comes Home from the Wars, parts 1, 2, and 3, will be performed at the Yale Repertory Theater through April 7th. More information on our website, wnpr.org/wherewelive. Thanks to Amy Boratko, literary manager at Yale Repertory Theater. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Where We Live is produced by senior producer Lydia Brown and producer Carmen Baskoff. Our technical producer is Kyone Wolf. WNPR's executive producer is Katie Tolarski. You can check out WNPR.org/wherewelive for more about the show. Thanks for listening.